have a very, very special guest. Of course, he's one of the most recognisable English cricketers of all time. It is Steve Harmison, and of course, he's a Newcastle fan as well, so it's the perfect combination. Steve, how are you today?
I'm very well. Very well after yesterday. It was I was a bit apprehensive of how it was going to go yesterday. I was a little bit concerned of Mike getting dragged back to a relegation, because I still think 39, 40 points is going to be somewhere where you need to be. But I thought the players were magnificent. I thought everybody was magnificent yesterday, and Newcastle can now potentially look at European places rather than relegation, which is fantastic.
Steady.
No, we'll go straight onto the football then, Steve. We'll talk about the game yesterday. Were you quite nervous going into the game against Sheffield United? Because Sheffield United have done really, really well this season under Chris Wilder. Or did you feel quite cautiously optimistic? Because they didn't really play brilliant against Aston Villa on Wednesday.
No, I was quite, to be honest, watching them against Aston Villa probably confirmed what I thought potentially could happen with Sheffield United. Sheffield United, a little bit like Newcastle, they've had this over the last 3 or 4 years. Newcastle under Rafa and then under Steve. That it's like everybody's against us, sort of thing. We're going to use the crowd to motivate us. We are a team that are galvanised together, and we're going to hit the opposition and not worry about anything else other than us. And if we're going to use the crowd to our advantage. And I think Newcastle have done that at St James's really well over the last year of Rafa, and obviously this year of Steve Bruce. And I thought that's what's kept Sheffield United going from last year when being successful in the Championship and elevating them to a position of European. But I thought once you take that crowd away and it just becomes skill factor and players alone, their ability, then I'm not sure that Sheffield United are as, maybe it's a little bit of a false place where they are from just a technical ability, and teams could exploit that. Actually, Newcastle potentially could, and that's why I feared for Newcastle a little bit. So that's why I thought it was a perfect game for Newcastle. That Newcastle's front three, the dynamic of Almiron and saint-maximin, and the work rate of Joelinton and his ability to hold the ball up. I actually think Newcastle have got a fantastic front three to play in this situation where catching teams on the break, and I thought they did that brilliantly yesterday. And I think that's why I thought Newcastle, it was a good game for Newcastle against Sheffield United. Same again when we come against Aston Villa next. West Ham, there's some good games for Newcastle coming up, and that's why I think Newcastle should be looking at potentially being at the top end rather than the bottom end.
Yeah, what did you make of Joelinton's performance in general, Steve? He got the goal which he desperately needed in the Premier League and at St James's Park. It was just ironic that he got it without any fans.
Yeah, and it's hard. I think the one thing I will say, I think I've been to every Newcastle home game this year, and I've not really heard too many fans turn on Joelinton the way potentially they could have. I think what we've got to remember is it's not Joelinton's fault that the Newcastle paid £40 million for him. And I think that seems to be everything that's thrown at the big fella up front. He works tirelessly hard. And I think if you ask your supporter, they'll say, yes, he's not worth 40 million quid. You ask one of the players he plays with and the amount of work he has to do by himself as a lone forward, centre forward, I think them players will say, this big guy, he does a lot of unnecessary work for us. And he helps us get up the pitch, and that's where we can use saint-maximin and Almiron. So you look at someone like Benteke for Crystal Palace at the minute, and the way Crystal Palace play, he's not too dissimilar to the way they're playing. Benteke is a big, strong boy who should score a lot more goals because of his technical ability, but he isn't scoring at this minute. But it's not stopping Roy Hodgson picking him, for one, and offering him a new contract, for two. And you look at them against, I can't remember the play the other night, they won 2-0 against Bournemouth, I think it was, and they were fantastic. Yeah. And I tell you what he was, Benteke was a handful at St James's. He played really well at St James's. So it's not all about the number 9 scoring a goal. Ideally, you want him to score, obviously. But I think the work that Joelinton does and the people that he occupies and the space that he creates for Almiron and saint-maximin, then I think he's, like I said before, it's not his fault he's worth 40 million quid. I don't think we have anybody like that. I don't think Andy Carroll consistently can do that because of his body. Dwight Gale hasn't got the physical presence to do that. So for me, I think Joelinton's done, really well, apart from what he's paid for, which is score goals. But I think he's created a hell of a lot of chances and space for other people for Newcastle United this year.
Yeah, Sam, what were you going to say? Because you wanted to get a question in as well about the game, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, from yesterday's game, Sheffield United didn't look to me like a team that were pushing on for Europe. And all of a sudden now we're breathing down their necks, as you say. But what do you make of the job Steve Bruce has done? Obviously, we've had legendary managers over the years like Sir Bobby and Kevin Keegan and to a lesser extent Rafa. Steve Bruce obviously isn't quite at that level, but what do you make of the job he's done so far this season?
I think he's done a great job, to be fair. I think the reason why Newcastle are in a position to get rid of Mike Ashley eventually is a lot down to Steve Bruce. I think if you're a Newcastle fan, as Newcastle went on that Far East trip, left Newcastle Airport to go on the trip to Far East in pre-season, if you just say Newcastle were going to be in a position to get sold for over 300 million less than 12 months' time, I think you'd have been laughing, because for the simple fact is we had Neil Redfern and Ben Dawson, two good guys taking them over there and in charge, not having a first team manager, staring down a barrel of waiting for the season to start. You are just you're thinking, well, this could be the final. This finally could be our nail in our coffin to potentially get relegated. And if Newcastle got relegated this year, you just look at across the road, over across the water there, and you look at where Sunderland are at this minute in time. I'm not sure Newcastle can come back from another relegation 3 times under Mike Ashley. So that is largely down to the way Steve Bruce has managed Newcastle United. I think when you look at the way Steve has conducted himself, I think he's done brilliantly to get Newcastle where they are on the pitch. But I think the best part of Steve Bruce as managerial position so far is the way he's conducted himself both on the touchline and in the media and around the club. He's not tried to get into that Rafa Benitez wall between the fans and the owner and try to bridge them apart, push them apart. He's left the club to be the club. He's respected the supporters' animosity toward the owner. He hasn't got involved, and he's basically said, right, all I'm going to do is concentrate on trying to keep this tight group of players who have worked so hard in the last 4 or 5 years to keep Newcastle in a position of strength and keep them, even when they had to bounce back at the Championship. And the squad togetherness, I need to keep that. Because if I keep that, then Newcastle have got a chance of not only surviving, but moving forward. And I think because of that, I think you've got to be thankful for the job he's done, because somebody else comes in there. These core of players that he mentioned in his after match chat yesterday, he said, these players that got us out of the Championship, the ones that have galvanised the club and stuck us together. If there was a little bit of a rift in that, and the water gets in and the air holes go, then I'm not so sure if a different manager comes in and tries to break that up, I'm not sure that galvanised group keeps Newcastle in the Premier League. And I think because of that, we've got to be thankful for the simple fact is if Newcastle are going to get relegated or in the bottom 3, close to the bottom 3, there's no way people from Saudi Arabia or America are going to come and take us off Mike Ashley. And that is the most important thing for Newcastle moving forward. Where he stands and where you see him going forward, look, you just don't know what other people have thoughts of it. But I think Newcastle fans, as much as they might not have wanted him at the start, I think they should be thankful for the position he's got us in at this moment in time, because we are in a position of strength to sell the club and eventually get rid of the person who has potentially held Newcastle back for the last probably 9 out of the 13 years of his tenureship.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point. You talked brilliantly about how well Steve Bruce has done. But you talked about the Saudis as well, Steve. And in the last 24 hours, there has been a couple more reports. Craig Coates just spoken to TalkSport very recently, say this is days rather than weeks now in regard to any potential takeover of Newcastle. You talked on TalkSport recently about Mike Ashley in the returns of the season ticket renewals and the fact that the club hadn't announced anything until very, very recently. Now, do you feel that now Newcastle, because as you mentioned, Steve Bruce has done such a good job into making sure Newcastle are going to be playing Premier League football next season, is now the perfect time for a potential new group, i.e. the Saudis, to come in and take over this football club?
Well, it is the perfect time, but until one of the sheikhs gets off a plane at Newcastle United with a black and white shirt on, I'll not believe it, to be fair. And then, whistling the theme tune to Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, and drinking brown ale. That is when I'll realise that it's going to come. But look, what Craig Hope has said this week, in those last 24 hours, I think one thing about Mike Ashley, he's a very, very good businessman. He's a very, very calculated guy in the media, and he knows what buttons to press to get things right. And I think legally he didn't have a leg to stand on with the season tickets, and I think he knew that. But I think the buttons he pressed, which was I'm not going to give the money back, still taking money for next year, I think that was a push to the Premier League to say, look, let's get this deal rubber stamped. Are you going to let Saudi Arabia buy Newcastle United? If so, get it done. If not, well, then I'm going to run the club my way, which is legally not right. But at the end of the day, he was going to want to be challenged. Personally, I think it's a conspiracy theory. I think there's no way in the world the government, the Premier League, wanted Newcastle to be taken over while we were close to lockdown, because I think there'll be more people outside St James's Park for Mike Ashley leaving than there was for Alan Shearer coming in 1996, and there was 35,000 then. So I think there might be a little bit of something in that. It's amazing that they might rubber stamp it as of sometime this week, when we go the government goes from 2 meters to 1 meter in the next 24 hours. So hopefully that is going to happen. But finally, I think it is the right time that Mike does go. What has he done for Newcastle United? Well, it's been a roller coaster. We've had some good times in the Championship, and we've had some not so good times in other times. The one thing we can be thankful of, I think, watching other programs and seeing other clubs go, that probably the only thing we can be thankful of Mike Ashley is that when he does leave Newcastle United haven't got a great big whacking debt hole that we can't fill, and we have to stagnate. We can move forward, and I think we've got a magnificent stadium in the middle of a city, and we are in the Premiership, and we are relatively debt free. So it's time for him to go, and I think it's a good time. Everybody can make their own mind up on what to think of Mike Ashley. Everybody can make their mind up. You support your club, and people come and go. Bobby Robson came and go. Kevin Keegan came and go. Alan Shearer came and go. The supporters will never ever go, because my kids will support Newcastle United. Your kids will support Newcastle United, and grandkids will support Newcastle United, and that's the most important thing. He's got 13 years of a history, which has been a lot checkered, but at the end of the day, fingers crossed, it's time for a move on. And thankfully, we might have an owner or an ownership of strength that can get Newcastle back to where we all want them to be, because no matter what club you support, you always want your club to be buying the best players, winning the most games, fighting for the most titles, and fingers crossed, Newcastle, it might be Newcastle's turn sooner rather than later.
I completely agree. I hope so as well, with the future of Newcastle, with the potential trader, if it all goes through as you've said.